Hey everyone, welcome to the podcast. And I'm very happy to have my guest this week is James Higginbotham. He's an author. He runs the API Weekly newsletter and is an all-around nice guy. So thank you for coming on the podcast today, James.
Thanks, Sid. I appreciate it. It's great to be here.
And as I mentioned earlier, for the one or two people who haven't heard your name before, but should know you, maybe you can give us a little background on how you got into this world of APIs and developer experience.
Yeah, absolutely. So my background's in software development, software architecture. I've done a combination of different types of engagements. I've been a consultant for more than 2 decades now, off and on, most of it on and not off. And I've been in the enterprise space. I've been in the startup space. I've actually been interim CTO for early stage startups. I've helped startups get up off the ground. And my background is pretty diverse. So a lot of folks may or may not remember the days of perhaps Corba, SOAP, service-oriented architecture. So I've been exposed to a lot of distributed computing over the course of my career and all these different kinds of engagements and things I've been doing. So about a decade ago, I really just said, you know what, I'm super passionate about APIs. I'm going to double down and just really focus on that. And so I shifted everything I did to focusing on helping enterprises as well as SaaS-based companies, startups of all sorts and flavors and locations to get their APIs in great shape for their developers. So it's just kind of evolved along the way after that, but it's all built on this career that's kind of been focused heavily on back end and interoperability and integration and that kind of world. So that's just really what led me to get into this API space and developer experience space.
Yeah, and you've taken those years of experience and you've put it in writing. So I for to prepare for this interview, I went and I got your book and read through several sections of it. And at the very beginning, you talk about these 5 principles of web API design, and I was wondering if you could just start us off by telling us what those 5 principles are for you.
Absolutely. Yeah, let me summarize them real quick and then we can dig in wherever you'd like. I have 5 principles that the book is built off of. So the book is Principles of Web API Design from Addison Wesley, or the Addison Wesley part of Pearson Publishing. And the first principle is API should never be designed in isolation. I think sometimes the best API designs result from collaboration with others. And so I get into what does that really look like. Principle 2 is API design starts with an outcome-based focus. If we really don't know where we're going, if we don't understand what the problem is and what the desired outcome or solution or end state is, then it's really hard to design an API that helps us get there and addresses those things. So it might push some data over the wire, but it doesn't deliver outcomes. And I think outcome-based is really important. The third is that API design can vary. So we need to pick the elements that really match our need. Most organizations that I work with today, they have a REST first approach. They'll follow REST patterns, and then they'll sprinkle in GraphQL, gRPC, whatever else they need, webhooks, WebSockets, and so on. But thinking about once we understand what we need and what we're trying to do, then picking the design elements and being willing to look outside of just a default decision is really important. The fourth is API documentation. It's the most important user interface for developers, and therefore we need to invest some significant time in our documentation efforts to make it easy to understand what the API does, how to use it to get things done, and to be able to maybe find new opportunities using API we hadn't thought of before by digging deep into documentation. So delivering great documentation is important. And then the fifth principle is that APIs are forever, so we have to plan accordingly. If we put some thoughtful design elements up front, we do some collaboration, and we put a little bit of effort into the design, it's going to pay off and it'll allow us to evolve the API, add to it. We can grow it over time. But the idea here is that, like Werner Vogel has mentioned with the Amazon S3 in the context of them building that, once they put that out there, everyone was using it. So we need to plan for change, but also do a little bit of planning up front so that our change doesn't break people long term, break their integrations and cause a lot of problems.
Yeah, that last one is a real important uh, one to live by, because changes like that, breaking changes, really can impact a lot of people's lives, and not in a good way sometimes. Um,
Very
but
true.
I think principle number 4 is the one that really sings to me and to the topic of our podcast, which is developer experience, and API documentation is so important to that.
Mm-hmm.
It's the heart of our experience, of how developers first interface with an API. You've probably seen a lot of examples of documentation over the years, and I'm wondering, are there common mistakes that you see when it comes to how people are approaching API documentation or building it or maintaining it, that we need to be aware of as we enter that space?
Yeah, absolutely. The most common mistake that I see is I think people, organizations that are documenting their APIs, if they don't have a dedicated technical writer or someone dedicated to that role that's separate from the implementation, then we also oftentimes find ourselves documenting the API right at the time of implementation. Maybe using code annotations or maybe building the API specification and documentation at that point in time. What that does is it forces us to think about implementation details. And if we're building a Java application and we're writing Java doc for some code, then we're probably making a lot of assumptions about who's reading that. It's going to be somebody internal, unless we're sharing out a library or something. It's an internal associate employee, someone on the staff at the place that you're at. But when we think about APIs and externalizing them, our consumers, we have no control over, and they don't have access to our private repositories, and they don't have the context. They weren't in the design meetings. They don't know why certain things were designed certain ways. There's no organizational knowledge that's transferred. And so they'll take an approach as if they're writing documentation for an implementation, and they'll miss that perspective of, I need to write this for someone who's never been in this organization before, was never in one single design meeting that we had, that has never seen the demo after demo as we evolved our design and implementation details of our API. I need to think about this differently. And if we don't have that mindset, then we're always going to fall into that mindset of just documenting from an implementation perspective. And that really offers a poor developer experience for that external developer that doesn't know what's going on with how it was designed, what its purpose is, and so they're looking at reference documentation and they can't really make sense of it, and they're either frustrated and they walk away, or they have to file support requests through whatever channels you make available, chat, form-based, whatever, to get some help. So I really encourage organizations to do two things. One is either separate out the documentation effort to someone who can come in with fresh eyes and really think from that outside in perspective, find someone from the team that can do that, and then couple with that, not just reference documentation and say open API specification or schema definitions in GraphQL or IDL for gRPC, any of those formats that we use for reference documentation, but to also document workflows, scenarios. How do I use that API and orchestrate it or choreograph different types of API calls to get done what I need done? So don't just give me the references, show me what's possible with additional documentation beyond that. That's what I see. So what ends up happening, unfortunately, is that first rev of the documentation is, it's a customer API and it manages customers, and I can get customers and I can filter on customers and I can update a customer and I can create a customer. And I'm like, okay, great. What does that really mean? What are the side effects of that? Why is this important to me? What is this enabling me to do that I couldn't do before? So that forces you to dig deeper into the documentation. And the biggest mistake is people don't take it that far. They just get that surface level documentation and then walk away, usually because they're too close to the metal of the code and the infrastructure and the decisions that have been made.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Yeah, I think you really nailed it when you started talking about the use cases and why should I care about this API? Because I think it is natural to think API reference documentation, as long as every endpoint and every parameter and an example response, as long as I have all that, it's going to be
Yeah, yeah,
obvious to the developer, and it's because you're so close to the problem that and you understand the context so well. You make a lot of assumptions, or you're just sort of blinded to it. So the fresh pair of
hmm
eyes, I
hmm
love that advice. That's great. um, Now, uh, your book is about web API design, so it goes from the
hmm
start all the way to the end. And I'm going to assume that good developer experience starts with good API design. So, um, what are some pieces of advice that you could offer someone who's starting a new project and building some APIs from scratch beyond those key principles that we talked about?
What I like to do is encourage people to first understand why the API is going to exist to begin with. And that means understanding the job to be done. So I really like this idea that came from Clayton Christensen, the job to be done or jobs theory that's been out. It's rooted in the voice of the customer, which was actually from the 80s. So we keep just slapping new names onto the same thing and maybe tweaking our ways of executing it, but it's all pretty much the same. Develop empathy for the problem space and what your API is going to solve. And doing that by taking a jobs to be done approach means that we start asking for one, what's the problem that we're trying to solve? It might just be some sort of workflow that you're trying to help someone to enable, or it could be something brand new. You're enabling them to do something they could never have done in an automated fashion before. And then once you understand that problem and where they're at and kind of how you're going to bring that solution to bear, you start to figure out what that API needs to do. So Clayton Christensen pushed the jobs to be done theory from the perspective of building businesses. He focused on startups, but this is applicable to any sort of business, enterprise or startup, SaaS or anything else in between. Is if we understand the problem and we understand what the desired result or outcome is, if we know what the end is and we know what the beginning is, the problem and the outcome, in the middle is some sort of job that needs to be done. And either someone's going to do it themselves and the API is going to facilitate that through a mobile, a web app, voice enabled app, uh, you know, some sort of Gen AI, front end to something, whatever it is, there's a job to be done. So they may be hiring your API so that they can do it themselves, or they may be hiring your API so that they can automate it out or have it done for them. And once we understand that, now we have a much clearer picture of what the API needs to do. You'll notice I haven't talked about HTTP, I haven't talked about JSON, I haven't talked about which method to use, or are we doing hypermedia or not? Are we using GraphQL or not? None of that. We need to understand the problem. And I teach this for enterprises as well. So if there's someone listening from an enterprise perspective and they're saying, yeah, we just facilitate these, interactions and we're just pushing data from system A to system B. Well, that may be very well the case, but there's also a lot of things that you're building to solve problems. And if we step back and instead of just assuming that we understand it, we do discovery, we apply a digital product mindset to it. Now we really have a framework to drive our API and to drive success with that API. And that can lead us to building acceptance tests so that we know that we delivered everything in the API that helps us get from the problem to that desired outcome. And we can figure out how many operations that API needs to have and what kind of inputs and outputs they'll need. And then we can shape that according to the API style that we want. Do we want to use or do we have to use REST, or are we preferring GraphQL? Do we think gRPC is a better fit? Is it something else that has come out since our recording right now that has emerged? It's all the same principle. The design style or protocol that you select should be dependent on solving the problem the best way possible. So if we can understand the problem and break it down and figure out what the capabilities of our APIs are, then we can apply the right design. And then our documentation becomes easier as well, going back to the last discussion we had there, because now we understand the problem better. We can frame our documentation from that perspective. So we're not just saying get customer and everything else. We're actually looking at what's the problem and what's this API solve, and we're using the vocabulary of that problem space, that segment of a market, a particular product, end user, and the vocabulary they use. Our documentation reflects that because we spent sufficient time to understand that problem, frame it, and then turn that into an API that delivers and perhaps automates that job to be done.
Yeah, I guess it's kind of an interesting dance, and it's always unique based on the company and based on the customer. Because if some product manager showed up at a customer and says, what do you need from us? Like the customer, some customers might know exactly what they want from as far as data or functionality that they want. Others, you might have to come with some ideas to the table and say,
Mhm.
this is what we're thinking about, and how might that fit into your business workflow, or how might that help you do those jobs, or maybe just the question is, what jobs are you trying to do today that you're unable to do with our assistance? We're here to support you as our customer. Is that how the conversations go? I'm curious about what you've
It
seen.
does. Yeah, it does. And if it's an enterprise, there's likely, unless the enterprise has a product centric view of the world, they usually execute on projects, not products. So they're going to fund things for a period of time. There's probably certain things that get out of it, and then they go, okay, we're done, on to the next one. And so that's a big shift for some organizations to start thinking that way. But it's a foundation that opens up a lot of opportunities. For SaaS-based companies, product managers that have delivered products to markets, whether it's consumer or B2B, so whether it's B2C, B2C, or B2B2C, or whatever variation that is, this is probably nothing new for you. But a lot of people that come either from a background of enterprise, maybe they worked in enterprise and now they're trying to launch a startup, and now they're making that shift. So their mentality is still in that enterprise space of, well, we're just going to do it's just a project based. We're just going to put something out there and people will use it. May not be necessarily the case. We need to do discovery. We need to have empathy. We need to interview. We need to apply those principles. So to the degree that they do it may vary, but the principles there are very sound in better understanding what is it you're really trying to do. You're asking for these elements of data. What are you trying to do? Is it just produce a report? Or are you making a business decision? And is the business decision dependent on more than just those fields? Maybe there's more that I know my systems can provide or my product can provide if I understand better about what you're trying to do. You're asking for these 3 fields, but really you need these 5, or really maybe we need to design an API that tells you by interpreting the data that we have. We might not want to release all of that data to someone.
Yep.
Maybe some of it we need to hold back. It's personally identifiable information, it's MPI data, it's sensitive data we don't want to release, but we could do the decisioning for you or interpret that data for you and then make that available to you if we understand. So it's communication. So I like to talk about to people, APIs have 3 levels of communication. There's machine to machine, which a lot of us as techies love to talk about and focus on, and that's important. But there's also the developer to developer, that documentation, but ultimately it's human to human. What are you trying to do? What's the workflow? What questions are you trying to ask? What problems are you trying to solve? What outcomes are you trying to achieve? And then how can we meet you there? And so it's a dialogue. You have to have a dialogue. You can't just immediately start coding when someone says, I need this. There's too many assumptions that we're all making, and we can't read each other's minds. So we need to start asking questions, and questions are the best way to get there.
Yeah, that's awesome. Great advice. Now, we were just talking about a brand new API, but I
Yeah.
think in reality, we live in a world with thousands and thousands of APIs. And I'm just wondering, how are companies dealing with this API sprawl or API through acquisition to still be able to deliver a good developer experience?
Uh, it's a fascinating question because the M&A side of things really make things difficult. I was recently working at a commercial insurance company that's very familiar in North America, and that it's very difficult because they had a lot of acquisitions. So their challenges evolve from having multiple products for the same market segments, perhaps. Sometimes it's competing products across different segments or for different audiences or different classifications of some sort. In some cases, they're complementary, but they have completely different processes on how they manage their workflow. And in this case, say, create quotes for policies and underwrite them and process claims and so on. So what we had to do is a few things. One is we had to step back and start to understand that from a platform perspective, if we think of what we're doing as a platform that other people build on, that platform is going to be comprised of different APIs. So could we spend a little time with subject matter experts across these different areas and understand and map out business processes and operating models? And that allows us to understand more about how things are flowing today. Then we can start to look at, are there APIs that represent how we do business today that we can leverage? Should we consider designing something net new and then adapting it to our backend systems? In other words, we own all that really hard translation layer and orchestration layer so that our market doesn't have to, our partners and customers don't have to.
Yeah.
Or do we look for opportunities to say this API has a better fit and a better usability opportunity for our marketplace, the capabilities it offers, the documentation's there, we have a really solid foundation, let's bring some other things over. So there's different ways to do that. In some cases, they'll run with multiple APIs in parallel, and what they'll do is they'll invest in improving the developer experience for those things. So if those were just, we built it for one or two partners, and it looks like there's a bigger opportunity as a result of maybe an acquisition or something else, then we can take the opportunity to improve it and allow them to exist in parallel. It makes it sometimes confusing message-wise to the market, but it is an option sometimes that people will do. Most of the time what I see is people will start to think about, what is our digital front door for our organization? These APIs are our digital front door for the organization. So if that's the case, how do we design an API that represents how we do business, the business capabilities we're bringing to the marketplace, the products, the services, the capabilities, and then using our IT capabilities, our technical software engineering capabilities, let's figure out how to bridge our different systems over time into that unified front door. And in the beginning, it can get ugly. You send an API request in and maybe it fires off an API to some other system, and it's doing all kinds of transformations, and it's talking XML or something else in the background, and all these different things, and it's translating things into what we would see as that digital front door, and we start to work on that.
Yeah.
So you can do it either way. You can try to improve what you have and maybe prefer one or the other, or you can sometimes use it as a facade. And I used to tell a lot of organizations, particularly enterprises, but also a software as a service company that's been around for a while. They've made several pivots. Their code is a little difficult to deal with. They're kind of getting frustrated with it. An API is an ultimate do-over for any kind of business, because you can rethink from afresh, from outside in, how are we presenting ourselves to the marketplace? What capabilities are we bringing to bear? And then we can do all that really hard work to adapt those rough systems that are kind of hard to deal with into that new API. And now we have a goal and a way to kind of work out the old stuff behind the scenes while we give someone a great developer experience up front, whether it's internal development staff, your workforce, or your partners or customers.
Yeah, I love that metaphor of a digital front door. I've definitely seen large enterprises working through that evolution, where they've got a portfolio and several different portals running in the background, but they create this unified entry point for developers so that they can then decide which path to go down. And often developers aren't jumping between those product lines because they're very different, but having that opportunity to evolve also on the API front, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because because like you said, if APIs are forever, how do we change things? And sometimes putting a new translation layer on top is key to that. That's really great. Um, so for APIs, development and building them, being the provider is really a big part of the equation. Um, the world that I've been swimming in is API consumption, and you talk
Mhm,
about that in your book when it comes
mhm,
to developer experience. So I'm wondering, you talked in your book about how many developers tend to use this term SDK and helper library interchangeably, and I've done that myself in the past. So I'm wondering for you, what distinction do you draw between those two things?
I so I come from a bit old school. I mentioned that I've been in this industry for a while now, and at the time when you downloaded an SDK to be able to do something, whether it was for the Microsoft operating system or whether it's for a third party tool or whatever, you were generally getting a number of things. One, you were getting example applications. You were getting libraries to help you talk to that particular piece of software in the programming language that you're working in. You're getting uh, reference applications or other things. You're getting documentation. You're getting a full suite of tools and resources. And when I think about helper libraries, I think, what's the minimum amount that I can provide to prevent someone from having to write the raw HTTP calls to my API?
Yeah.
So the helper library to me is that particular programming language binding. The SDK is that helper library and then some. It's the examples, it's the documentation, it's in some cases I see people will release reference applications. They might put it on GitHub or GitLab or somewhere, and they'll host it publicly and say, I have to just clone this, drop in a key, and you can run this pet store app or airline app or whatever it is. It demonstrates how to use their particular API, and so you can actually, without having to understand how to use it, go through a demo and and understand, and then have a foundation for how to use different operations within the API. So I kind of differentiate them that way. I know they are oftentimes used interchangeably, but I would see an SDK as something that's really more like a product that you're packaging and managing cohesively with a lot of resources and very detailed documentation for that programming language to help them use the API, as opposed to just open API specification docs that show you how to use the HTTP capabilities, but don't show you the particular programming language. We see the really popular vendors like the Stripes and the Twilios and stuff. They kind of blend that idea on their sites. They have their documentation not only shows you how to the definition of the HTTP operation, all the details, all the HTTP details for the operation, but they also show you how to use each of the different SDKs across all of those different languages, so you can tab to the one that you want, and they give you an example of how to use it that way as well, which is kind of an interesting way to do it. You're not really packaging up an SDK for download. You're really just saying, here's the helper library, and then the SDK is really kind of hosted on their site. But I differentiate it that way. And the other thing that I would say is, to me, I would almost call a helper library just like a thin wrapper. So it's basically just going to be helper methods to call the HTTP. So I'm probably going to pass in some key value pairs or some sort of struct or object that represents that request. To me, an SDK is more like a DSL, a domain specific language. It's really designed to take the idioms of that programming language and make them available in a way that allows you to interact with that API more efficiently. So it
Hmm.
might, instead of just offering these operations that do the HTTP work underneath the covers, they offer helpers, and maybe they have extra work or extra code in them to do retries for idempotent operations that, if it fails, if we have a network error, I could just call it again and it'll result in the same thing. So I'm okay. I know I can do it. Maybe it helps me to uh, use the idioms in the language, like a special kind of block or something like that in that language, and it extends the language itself almost with the domain language that reflects what the API does. That's a little bit more than a helper library that just sort of wraps HTTP, in my opinion.
Yeah. Yeah. I've definitely seen that where when you start to move beyond a helper library, you're really solving anything that's, I would say, complex.
Hmm.
It could be authentication, could be binary. Working with binary data through an API can be sometimes a little tricky depending on the language.
Hmm.
Um, and also, I like that you call out all those different things like retries. I imagine logging. There's just
Yes.
all additional things that developers probably want, but if they're not getting those in the helper library, maybe a full SDK experience with the documentation and code samples or example apps and everything built around it could help them start consuming that API a little bit quicker and not reinventing the wheel every time they get onto your API.
Yeah, absolutely. The other thing that I've seen them used for that's really an interesting use case that I don't see too many people take advantage of is if you uh, really build your SDKs in house, you can generate them with tooling like API-Matic or other solutions. Um, if you do that, or you hand build it, or handcraft it, or some combination, maybe use the code generators, and then you build something on top of it to sort of make it a little bit easier to use in each language or something, or provide that extra layer like you were talking about. We were talking about what happens when you inherit APIs are not as great or don't have as great a developer experience. That's another strategy some organizations have taken and said, okay, what if we admit readily that our API is less than ideal for design, and that our naming conventions are all over the place, and we use item here and product here, and we weren't consistent,
Yeah,
and the way we handle errors aren't consistent, and everything else. Hide that in your SDK. So it's more work, but what you can say is, we know we have some flaws, but we also know that you probably don't want to have to spend a lot of time migrating to a brand new version because we don't feel like everything's up to quality and we want to build something new. Well, that's probably one, going to take us a while, and two, you may or may not want to do that. Here's an SDK that unifies the disparate error messages, unifies the naming conventions, aligns the API on behalf of the developer. Again, it's a lot of work. If you have an ecosystem with just a couple, three programming languages that are primarily used for your API, then maybe it's a little bit easier. If you don't really know, you might have to support 10 plus programming languages and framework variations on top of that and everything else. It could get a lot more difficult. But that is a strategy that's really powerful to allow people to do things and to hide some of those decisions that we've learned since then that we would have not made before, but they're made, they're there, and we can't break anything. And so the next best thing is say, you know what? Yep, you can talk to our API directly, but we realize that the cognitive load of understanding our API from our reference docs is a bit more than you might want. So here's some SDKs, and this will make it a little bit easier for you.
yeah. So another thing you touched on in your book is around where these helper libraries originate from. And
Mm-hmm.
we've talked about API providers could build these. We also have community people in the community contributing these, or a consumer generated. Um, and I maybe you can clarify what you mean by consumer generated in those three.
Yeah. So what I just spoke about in that last example would be the provider generated or provider supported, provider managed. The idea that the team that designs and implements the API is also responsible for the SDKs. They know the API the best. If they have the budget and the ability and maybe adopt some tooling to help accelerate that effort, they're the ones that are best suited, most likely, to build that SDK for a community. And if they have experts in that programming language, then they'll be following the idioms of that language. And so it won't look like someone from the Java world wrote something, for Go or something like that, and things just don't make sense. So a Golang developer picks up the library and says, this is not how we do stuff in this world, and gets frustrated with it. So in that case, the provider team has taken on that expense and that cost. Now, it does come with a price because now every time we have to make a little minor improvement to the SDK, we have to version that SDK. And so the version number of the SDK in a particular programming language will always be different than perhaps the advertised version number of the API. Is it V1, V2, whatever it is? Those versions don't align. When you're trying to troubleshoot errors, it can be difficult because the consumer is saying that this isn't working, and you got to ask, well, what version of the SDK? Maybe they haven't upgraded to the last version. So there can be some challenges there. But what I've found is if you're providing an API over HTTP, as the provider, to me, it seems like you should really be on the hook to deliver a terrific developer experience for SDKs as well. But in some cases, in a lot of cases, organizations don't do that. Product companies choose not to do that for whatever reason, constraints or whatnot.
Yeah.
So when that happens, then the community contributed comes in. Somebody says, well, I'm using this API and there's no SDK, or the SDK that the provider is using is just not really matching the language dynamics. And I know how to use Golang, or I know how to use Java or whatever, and I'm going to do this. Or it's using an older version of, say, Java. It was built for Java 8, and now we're on Java, whatever we're at now, 15, 16, 18, 35, whatever it is when you're watching this, because they're releasing at such a great pace now compared to the way it used to. So whatever it is, maybe there's some feature in a newer version that the SDK, for backwards compatibility reasons, they can't adopt. So then the community says, look, I'm going to build one. We saw that a lot in the early Twitter days. Everybody was building apps on every phone platform before the iPhone was out. We had Nokias and everything else, and everybody was building client apps. And as a result of building the client apps, they built consumer libraries for those environments, and they would open source those and say, build your own for the BlackBerry or the Windows Mobile incarnation number 5 of whatever the OS was for that phone or something. So there's this idea here of, well, maybe the communities can come in and fill in where the providers don't have the expertise or don't have the time or resources to do that. The difficulty becomes, what happens on the provider side when someone's using that community contributed SDK? Well, if you didn't have an SDK, or if you have one you're supporting yourself as a provider, you're now ultimately going to have to be responsible for understanding that community provider. When you're going to have to dig in, you're going to find someone that understands that language, those libraries that were used, because whether you like it or not as a provider, that community contributed library, if it starts gaining traction, it is in essence representing you, even though you didn't create it yourself. It represents you, and people will automatically derive their poor or great developer experience from that third-party library that you had nothing to do with. They're still going to hold you accountable to it. So it becomes very difficult to do. But there's trade-offs. So it depends on, the organization and what kind of capabilities you have. The third one I talked about was consumer generated. And that's where I, as the consumer, say, you know what, provider, don't worry about it. In fact, I would rather kind of manage the helper library or the SDK myself. So I'll tell you what, you give me the open API specification. And as a matter of fact, I happen to have my own client library code generator. We built it in-house. We invested in it. It's designed to have a more robust error handling approach, and it logs to the logging environments that I prefer. So you don't have to know about how I manage my logging environments, and my observability and everything else. And maybe I want to use a third-party API client gateway to proxy between me and your API. And if I use your SDK, your host name is hard-coded, and I can't override that. So I can't direct it to my internal gateway that's going to steward and rate limit and do all the things I want to do and add additional observability and failover and things that I might need. I can't do that if I use your library, but if you just give me the open API spec, I'll use a code generator myself and generate it. So that's the consumer generated side. And what that does is says the consumer saying, I'll own that whole experience. If you give me great docs and a very thorough open API specification so I can code generate from it, I'll own how I manage that, and I'll let it work and thrive in my environment with my tooling and my infrastructure, my patterns and practices, rather than you enforcing yours on me as the consumer. So it takes a little bit more effort because now the consumer, has to do all that work. But if there's been investment in client libraries, or if they've perhaps licensed a commercial tool to generate their SDKs, then they could just leverage that investment they already have and have it generated for them, and they can own that and then extend it however they want to provide the developer experience that they need and the observability and management that they need of consuming third-party APIs.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really thank you for that. That was a very thorough breakdown of those three different options. And I think the word that stuck out there for me was trade-offs. That
Mm-hmm.
you've got to put some thought into which approach is going to be right for your API and for your company. And um, you know, owning those SDKs, that's a big investment and long-term responsibility to keep them maintained. Nothing looks worse on your GitHub repo than an ignored SDK. And then like community ones, those can be just a really great experience where you're collaborating with the community. But
Mm-hmm.
at the same time, some of the folks that build these, it's not their full-time job. They move on to another project. They don't have as much time. And again, those kind of fall on disrepair. And then I would say from my own experience, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, because that consumer generated option is really enticing, I think, because you're thinking, wow, all I have to do is maintain an open API definition, put it up on my website, and I'm good to go. And what I've found with the free tooling out there is that um, they all have their own little quirks of how they interpret the API definition.
Mm-hmm.
And quite often we don't keep our API definitions at code quality. To generate really great code, we have an API definition that can generate docs, but docs don't compile. So,
Right.
and then you get the issue of like, it generates great, let's say it generates great Python code, the templates, but the templates for Rust are not as mature. And so if I'm
Mm-hmm.
a Rust developer, I'm a little bit disappointed because like the tools aren't, or the templates aren't really there for me. So like there's all these trade-offs and calculus that goes into this. And do you see companies doing hybrid, like where they're like, we do have our top languages that we're going to build for and support, but then we also welcome those community contributions for maybe the languages we haven't gotten to? What have you seen out there?
Yeah, most of what I've seen is exactly that. When an API initially launches, they'll usually have one, two, maybe three languages they support. The
Yeah.
top three, and that means understanding who's going to be using your API. So not only have you had to spend enough time to understand what the API should do and how to design it well and how to document it well, but do you understand the consumers that are using it? Should I be building PHP and Python? Should I be doing Java and .NET? Or some combination of those things, because we're gaining traction in certain areas. So they may, hedge a bet in one, two, three camps and start there, and then move on from there. I unfortunately, rarely see a lot of Open API docs shared. I wish more people would share their Open API docs, or if they're there, they're not really making it prominent.
Yeah.
They've generated the documentation, but they're not sharing the Open API spec they use to generate that documentation. And I'm not sure why that's the case, because there's a lot of value in offering that up to, just like you said, use that kind of strategy of, here are the two or three we're going to market with. Our best hypothesis is that these are the three programming languages that are most likely to be used in the markets we're going after, or the partners we're integrating with. And so we're going to go use those, and here's the Open API spec for anybody else. And I agree with you. A lot of the generators that are free out there are not that great. What I do see is I see organizations now investing in code generation efforts to speed up their work. So they're building their own. but primarily because the open source stuff doesn't understand their environments. They've made certain decisions about what kind of environments they're using and how they're doing different things along the way, and what what observability frameworks and network environments and platforms and things they're leveraging. And so that means that they have to, by virtue of what they're doing, they have to generate their own libraries to make it work in their environment. So I am seeing some organizations start to invest in that a little bit more, and I would love to see more investment in the open source code generation libraries. I think there's a lack of documentation on how some of those generators work, so it's really hard to go in there and contribute if you don't understand how many levels of indirection there are in the generation library, because they use some third party to generate the code generation, or they're using some tool or framework or something to generate it. It becomes very difficult to understand how to contribute to those. So then they go left, they're kind of left to their own, unfortunate situations where, we could improve these libraries if we knew how this worked, but I don't have the time to go in and figure out how this person who built this library thought about code generation, and they didn't document how their code generation engine works. So it causes a lot of problems. But I think a hybrid approach is generally what we end up seeing in a lot of situations.
Yeah. Yeah, I found that you don't know what you don't know quite often. And I found myself not knowing, did I do something wrong in my API definition? Or is there something wrong in the engine? Or is there something wrong in the templates? And so I would go around tweaking different parts of that puzzle to try to get the output that I was ideally looking for. And I'm sure I made a lot of mistakes along the way and learned things, but it's not always ideal. But if you don't have any other options, you might have to go down that route. I'm wondering if you're a provider, or if you want to start building an SDK for your favorite, or a helper library for your favorite API, what sort of documentation do you see, and like maybe how might you rank it in sort of importance? Like what kind of documentation should people include and kind of build upon if they're putting out those helper libraries or SDKs?
Yeah, I think we have to keep in mind that if you put out an SDK, and I've seen this before, and it's unfortunate, if you put out an SDK and the SDK simply points to your reference docs for your API, then I can understand what you're asking for from an HTTP perspective, but I don't know what you want from this particular language perspective. So it means documenting like you would your API, you need reference documentation for your SDKs. So for each operation in your SDK that is representing an operation on your API, definitely have a hypermedia link or have a link in the docs to the API reference documentation so that people can see in detail how it works. But just delivering, in this case, I'll give you an example, a helper library for, I believe, the Twitter V1 API I was using. They forced you to have the library docs open so you could see what class names and method names were available in the SDK. Then likewise, you had to have another window or tab open with the Twitter documentation. And they said, well, just take the fields from Twitter and pass them in as the key and then put the value in, and that's how you do it. I'm like, well, that's, so basically you stopped me from making an HTTP call. You stopped me from putting in the verb, the method, the HTTP method, and you stopped me from building the URL, and you stopped me from maybe composing JSON or using a struct to generate JSON. You're doing that. You're not doing much, and you're actually making it harder, because if I'm using that API for the first time, I now have to learn two things. So when you're documenting your SDKs, assume someone doesn't know what the API does or how it works. Assume they don't have the time to go figure out your SDK way of thinking and the API's way of thinking and to reconcile it, which means duplicating documentation. Some of the reference documentation you have in your Open API spec may need to go into your SDK to be able to help the person at the time of coding understand that, especially if they're using an IDE like VS Code or IntelliJ or any of these. Some of these IDEs are very sophisticated and they'll pull the docs out. If you hover over them, they'll pop the docs inline as a popover. Well, wouldn't it be great that it didn't just say, go see this URL on the website for our HTTP details, but instead it had the same stuff.
Yeah.
So what I would say is when we deal with documentation, and as a general rule, the dry principle, don't repeat yourself, that gets overused and misunderstood in software development. People think, don't write the same code twice. No, it's don't write the same business logic twice. So that if your business rules change, you have to change it multiple places, and there could be bugs where the old rules are running in parallel to the new rules and things break. Don't repeat yourself is meant to make it easier to introduce change into a code base without introducing bugs. Dry at a documentation level is the worst thing you can do. And as developers, we try to save time and say, well, we did it over here, so I'll just put a hypermedia link. But really contextually for an SDK, in someone's IDE, they want the docs right there. They want examples right there. They want code snippets they can copy and paste and run and get that time to hello world or time to 200 is another way I hear it said, to see that that operation works, that I put the right token in, that I've got the right little bit of code, and then I got something back and everything's good. And I have confidence to move forward. And then I'm not writing a bunch of code in vain and I'm going to end up not being able to use it because I misunderstood the API, or I can't get my access tokens to work because I'm putting the wrong token in. I'm putting my client ID and secret in instead of my token in, or I'm putting it not in the header, I'm putting it in the URL because that's the way a different API works. There is a learning curve to every one of these things. So how can we make it as easy as possible? So repeating documentation, keeping it up to date in multiple places, having contextual help, having examples, those are the types of things that I would encourage people to think about when they're producing an SDK or a helper library. Don't just assume somebody has a 3-monitor setup, and it looks like, some military operations center or NOAA's operations center for weather disasters and so on. And they've got screens everywhere that they can have docs open all over the place to try to understand how to use your API. Have empathy for that first-time learner, for that person who maybe hasn't used an API before and doesn't understand all the details of an HTTP. They may have used APIs before, but they've never seen it over the wire. I do training, APIcoach.io. I do a lot of API training, and about 25% of live workshops that I deliver have not seen HTTP go over the wire. We can't assume that everybody has the same experience you do. So documentation is absolutely critical, whether it's the API itself, whether it's the SDKs, getting started guides, examples and things like that go a long way to help people understand how to use your API and use it successfully.
Yeah. Wow. I love the thrown in the E word there, empathy, for developers. And I think what you just said really, again, it just resonates when you think about using an open API definition as a source of truth. It's from that source of truth that if you have the right machine, you can generate that unique documentation in different contexts in multiple languages, for example, in addition to a RESTful API reference. You can get all of that without having to maintain it in 7 different places if you've got the right API definition that's written well. So I like to wrap up with a fun question. I don't know if it's fun or not, but it's a popular topic, I think, which is, and this circles back to the beginning of our conversation, APIs are forever. So API deprecation. What advice can you offer teams that want to retire an API, an endpoint? Do we need to retire endpoints? Do we need to deprecate? What is your thoughts on this topic?
I would say you've got to put your product management hat on for that one. This is not something that a developer gets to choose because they don't like the way they named the path or something else, which if people that are watching or listening to this are like me, I'll get frustrated or get a tick, or it'll stand out. It'll be that thing that's like, oh, there's a spot on the wall. And after you see it, you always see it.
Yes.
Or it's the broken window syndrome of, once this is broken, I don't care about the rest of this. I'll just make the quickest decision possible because who cares? It's already terrible. It's already broken. It's already inconsistent. Might as well make it more inconsistent. There's this desire sometimes to deprecate our APIs in favor of something new as the provider when it's delivering value. It's solving problems. People don't care. They wrote the code once to deal with that. That code exists now and is running no matter what you name something. No matter if you used lower camel case for your paths and now you're using dashes, kebab case, and that just really frustrates you. Yeah, but how much value is it generating the consumers that are using it? So most of the time, I think we talk about deprecation from the perspective of the design's not as ideal, it didn't work out as well. However, if from a product management perspective, you look at this and say, realistically, the business can't sustain this API, the cost, the maintenance, the infrastructure costs, the operational costs of supporting this API, unless we increase the price or start charging for it or doing something else. And you have to go back and evaluate that and figure out, is there value in it if you doubled the price? Would people still pay it and you can afford to keep it? If you hit any of those answers as no, or no longer it's viable, then yes, you can deprecate it. But to do that means you need to give people another option. You either go find another partner, you go find somebody else doing the same thing and go talk to them and ease the transition and say, we've built an informal partnership. We're going to do a handoff. Here's how you're going to do this. They're going to give you a couple months free to ease the pain of transition, whatever it is. Or you're deprecating because you've got something better. Maybe you were thinking about that digital front door and you want to get people off that old API and you want to move them to that new one. That's where you have to start putting on that product manager hat that says, how do I make this enticing? How do I add even more value to make it worth dedicating a development team or individual to go change that code that works perfectly right now and deal with the bugs and everything else that comes from writing new integration code? How do I entice that company? Because you, as an owner of an API that's either a product or it's either an API as a product, like a Stripe or a Twilio, or it's an API for a product that you're allowing people to automate your platform, whatever it is, maybe it's an enterprise API for a partner, whatever it is, you risk customer churn anytime you make someone rewrite that integration code. Because if they got to rewrite it, they could just as easily go choose another vendor, go through the procurement process, and write that code against another vendor as wrote it against yours. So we have to make it valuable. So you evaluate, do I really have to do this? Is there ways that I can make this better? Could I leverage an SDK or something to kind of extend the life of this thing and not deprecate it? Is it delivering value? If it's a loss leader and I need to correct that, can I start charging if I'm not charging, or charge more and still deliver value? Because people, they might be paying you more per month or per year or whatever that contract is for, but ideally, it's probably still less than the cost of them having to make the cost of change to another vendor or cost of change to another API that you're building. So I think deprecation is rarely talked about in light of the overall product management side of the equation, the value that's delivered. We just worry about, how do I get somebody from this janky API that I built 10 years ago and I really didn't know what I was doing, but people are using, to this new lovely API that follows all the wonderful patterns and is well documented and everything else. How do I get people over? And we start thinking about, what does it mean to the ecosystem? What does it mean to the marketplace? What does it mean to my consumers if I deprecate this? And then if we decide on that, then it's a matter of updating documentation and giving plenty of time and giving up an exit path or an onboarding path to some other solution, whether it's your own or somebody else's.
Yeah.
There's a lot of work that goes into that.
Yeah, and again, it sounds like every company that faces this question is going to be unique. They're going to have their own unique circumstances to consider.
Hmm.
Um, I do agree that uh, carrots are always better than sticks.
Hmm.
So I've seen situations where the old API continues running, but only new features and new properties are exposed through the new APIs. So it incentivizes people who want to
Hmm.
do more with your API to make that transition. Um, and only like only under pretty rare circumstances do you want to fully replace it and go through that whole migration from a V2 to a V3. And you want to give lots of time. Otherwise, people, like you said, will look for other solutions. I think we can agree that the worst reason would be because, uh, like you said, I don't like the style in which this was written, and therefore, because it was 10 years ago and things are different now, we do things better now. That would be a bad reason. Would you say that if the code base has gotten to the point that it's dragging down your ability to um, improve and maintain the API because it was written in such a way that like change management has slowed progress on the API? Is that a reason enough, or is that even kind of case by case basis?
I've seen that a couple of times. What I would say is, could you take the existing API as it stands today, re-implement it in a new programming language if that's the need, or just rebuild it in a modular monolith or in some way that allows you to manage it operationally in a more cost-effective way, in a more predictable way, and better uptime, better SLA. If there's ways to do that, but to honor the same specification,
Yeah,
then really you can manage that through your API gateways by just standing up two of them in parallel and switching them over. And if and you have requests coming in, so barring sensitive data that you would have to sanitize, you can take requests, save them, and replay them, and make
yeah,
sure you get the same response. So you have a baseline to compare that to, in addition to whatever tests you have, because you're testing your code, right? So
yeah,
you have those as well. So you could, bring those across and test your APIs, your new API, just like you would the current API. But I don't know that it makes sense to deprecate an API and force people to make a consumer side client code change because you made some poor engineering decisions along the way.
yeah,
Sometimes we make those decisions and with best intent, and we learn later that it doesn't work, or sometimes we just made them because of other reasons that maybe people don't even remember anymore. But that contract and the behavior and the way that people are using that API is very important to your consumers. And so your one entity is the API provider, but you may have thousands of consumers. So your one decision can impact 1,000 people. So are you ready to say the same thing to 1,000 different people? I'm sorry, but we can't do this because of X, Y, and Z. We're going to deprecate it or we're going to replace it, and that's going to require you to make a code change. So there are ways, because APIs are server side, we can use the network traffic, we can use our gateways and maybe even our service meshes or whatever else we have in place. We can leverage those infrastructure components to give us a very clear way of getting to something better that performs better, maybe even a different cloud environment or whatever we have to do, or off of an on-prem environment to a cloud environment, or off of cloud and on-prem, or whatever it is. We can do that because our API contracts and the way that HTTP works from its layering characteristic affords us the ability to do that. So we can evolve the back end without impacting the front end as best as possible, and not demand that 1,000 different people spend 80 developer hours retooling some libraries on their side because you made some poor engineering decisions, or you adopted a database vendor that is just not performing well because the amount of data you have doesn't support that anymore. I really don't care as your consumer,
yeah,
what decisions you made. But what I do care about is I'm busy doing other things. I can't stop and do that. Now, maybe it's in my best interest to have better performance because your performance is degrading, sure. But why is it my problem as a consumer? So one API that I remember distinctly, there's a company called HomeAway that's based in Austin that I met many developers from. They're like an Airbnb,
Mm-hmm.
or a VRBO. They're in that same area, and they had their own core APIs. And one of their business strategies that's publicly well known is that they acquire rental companies, vacation rental companies. And most vacation rental companies run on one of a few systems, and I think it's one of them that's the most popular is called Fusion. There's different versions of it out being used by different companies, but in effect, it's the same vendor over and over again. They got really good at migrating all that data into their own internal systems. And they had a core API that they managed. And they made sure the consumer never cared. They actually do transformations. You could call that API for using the version that was 18 months old, and they would transform it up to the current version, execute the logic, and transform it back to the response that you expected 18 months ago. And they made sure that versioning was their problem as the provider, not the consumer's problem. That deprecations were their problem, not the consumer's problem. It was a fascinating way to do it. Stripe has to do the same thing because they can't expect every mom and pop to go pay some developer to go upgrade OS Commerce or WordPress or whatever to the
Yeah.
latest version of the Stripe API. So they have the same kind of problem. So they use those types of strategies to isolate the ripple effect to the consumer. And there's sometimes, I think, a lot of opportunity there that's left untapped by providing teams to say, you know what, all of this is on us, not on the thousands of consumers that are using our API. We're going to own this. We're going to own versioning. We're going to own deprecation. We're going to own all that stuff. This is on us, and we're going to abide by the contract that we gave people. APIs are forever, and we need to respect that. So maybe that's not necessarily a requirement, of a non-functional requirement of your product or your particular enterprise or something. Maybe it's you have a different environment, different context. You don't have to adopt that. But I think we probably see a really interesting shift in conversations if we focused on the consumer first instead of what's best for the provider first.
That's great advice, and I think what you're describing is even having empathy during an API deprecation conversation, and
Yeah.
always thinking about the customer, the developer at the other end of that API that's consuming it. So, thank you so much, James, for joining me. This has been a really enlightening and inspiring conversation. So I appreciate you taking the time to join me on the podcast today.
Yeah. Thanks, Sid. I appreciate the opportunity.
All right. We'll talk to you soon.
All right. Thanks. Bye.
Take care.